Singapore is considering using carbon credits to help it reduce its carbon footprint, with the Trade and Industry Ministry telling the Straits Times that carbon credits will complement our efforts in encouraging industrial energy efficiency and adopting emissions reduction measures. Now, to further explain this is Science and Environment correspondent Audrey Tan. Welcome to the show, Audrey. Audrey, what are carbon credits and how will that help Singapore reduce its carbon emissions?
Hi, Jan. Okay, so a carbon credit essentially means that if a buyer buys a carbon credit, you can offset your emissions based on emissions reduction that is happening elsewhere. So for instance, in Singapore, if let's say we are emitting carbon dioxide emissions from Jurong Island, what Singapore can do is we can buy carbon credits coming from, say, like a forest conservation project in Indonesia. And every ton of carbon dioxide that forest sequesters, takes in and stores it underground in the soil, we can minus that ton of emissions from our inventory. So that is, in essence, how carbon credits work and how that will help Singapore achieve its climate pledge. So it will help in terms of accounting because, I mean, based on the way I described it earlier, even though the emissions are still coming from Singapore on our side, we can buy carbon credits to kind of offset it. But this is just meant to be a complementary strategy to helping Singapore meet its climate pledge of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, because the amount of efforts that we can do domestically is limited. So let's say most of our emissions now come from burning fossil fuels. Sometimes it's not immediately possible for us to decarbonize our energy grid totally. So in the short term, buying carbon credits will enable us to offset our emissions, even as we undertake strategies that would require longer term to manifest, like deploying solar panels, importing renewable energy, and developing and doing research into low carbon technologies.
Right. Audrey, separately, I understand you'll be in Glasgow for the UN's climate change conference, COP26. It's a crucial step in setting worldwide targets to slow global warming. However, while 60 nations have pledged that their emissions will reach net zero by a certain time, Singapore hasn't yet indicated that it will be improving its climate pledge. What's the latest there?
Yes, so I will be going to Glasgow with David Fogarty, our climate change editor. And yes, as you mentioned, one of the key aims at this year's meeting is to get countries to show greater climate ambition. And by that, we mean set bolder climate targets that will say that, okay, I'm going to reduce my emissions by a lot more. And in the lead up to this year's conference, we have many countries coming forward with net zero targets. So even our closest neighbors have already done so, like Malaysia by 2050, Indonesia and Thailand by, I think, 2060 and 2070. Singapore, on the other hand, our net zero pledge is a bit more vague. We said last year that we will have our emissions reach net zero as soon as viable in the second half of the century. So actually, I'm writing a piece on this which will be published tomorrow. But just to give you a bit of a teaser, Singapore is facing many constraints in terms of decarbonizing it completely. As you asked me earlier about what's the value of carbon credits, and in the short term, it's very difficult for Singapore to decarbonize completely because we don't have large areas of land to soak up all the sunshine and so on. So we do face constraints that will limit us from reaching net zero by 2050. But I mean, having been reporting on climate change for a while now, I feel like I do see the writing on the wall. Like even in the past 2 years alone, we see so many developments that could put Singapore in a better position to make bolder climate pledges going forward. Examples include we face constraints in terms of decarbonizing our energy, which is now mainly from fossil fuels. But in the past 2 years or so, we see more pilots being announced about importing renewable energy from Malaysia, from Laos, from Indonesia. And just earlier this week, we saw that there's a subsea cable project connecting a solar farm in Australia to Singapore, and that construction for that will begin by 2023. So if Singapore can import more renewable energy, then that would put us in a better position to decarbonize our energy grid and help us to meet our emissions. So I do think that for now, maybe Singapore is adopting a more cautious approach. Other countries make net zero pledges at the get-go, and then years later, they follow up with an action plan. For me, it seems that Singapore is doing the opposite. We are laying out the frameworks, putting all our chicks in a row before we come up with the climate pledge. So I do think that we can expect Singapore to make greater and more ambitious targets soon, hopefully in the future.
Thank you for your perspectives, Audrey. We'll be checking in again with our science and environment correspondent, Audrey Tan, as COP26 draws nearer. In the meantime, tomorrow's paper will have more on this gathering and, of course, on Audrey's piece as well, so look out for that.